let's move on now to our keynote speech and speaker this morning. Someone who has, if you look in your Z cards and the background material, you'll agree has a very impressive CV. Dr. Lilian Hunt is the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in Science and Health lead in the Wellcome Trust's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion team, and is a champion of inclusive research, design and practice. I'm told Dr. Hunt will touch upon how the Wellcome Trust has addressed issues of equality, diversity and inclusion in both setting the agenda for research and prioritising what's being done. And they'll touch upon wider learning from that. So please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Lilian Hunt.
Hi everyone, this is the nervous test to see whether or not my microphone's working well enough. Naturally, I would have loved to have been there in person. I really wanted to join you all in Swansea, but I was floored with COVID all of last week. So I had to make sure that I didn't have brain fog and fatigue today. So firstly, a huge thank you to the organisers of today's conference, both for inviting me to speak and also for keeping the faith that I would recover in time to be able to talk today, as well as pivoting to online for me. With online, that comes with the nervousness that at any moment my cats could burst through the door behind me. If that happens, I'll try and keep calm, carry on, and you might just see me holding one in the hope that he'll calm down. So fingers crossed that won't happen, but otherwise it really has been a priority for me to come back to work to kind of talk to you today, because I was both delighted to hear the topic of the day, people make research, but also to hear about all the efforts that have gone into making the event itself inclusive and accessible. So I want to talk a little bit primarily about Wellcome and our kind of relatively new strategy, and then how our equity, diversity and inclusion work specifically feeds into that, as well as some more personal reflections on this work. So more broadly with the work of Wellcome Trust as a whole, and sort of how we hope to have impact and how we approach people make research. We are by no means perfect. That's really something that I want to make sure is very clear. But we are well resourced and we are afforded the opportunity to be bold and to experiment. Our independence provides a platform for us to kind of challenge the way things are normally done, even within our own walls. With that independence comes a responsibility to the ultimate beneficiary of our efforts, society. So Wellcome supports science to solve the urgent health challenges facing everyone. We are a global charitable foundation that is both financially and politically independent. We fund researchers across a broad range of disciplines to both explore and expand our understandings of life, health and well-being, as well as to address gaps and bottlenecks in solving specific challenges. So we support the development of tools, technologies and interventions as well to open up new fields of research, but also find new solutions to health challenges. And we engage with others across society, around the world, and keep urgent health challenges high on political agendas, as well as working with affected communities and building alliances to drive specific and systemic action. We have committed to spending £16 billion on our mission between 2022 and 2032. Now, we achieve our mission through 4 integrated programs, and these are relatively new, a couple of years now, but it's important to note that we have had a shift in our strategy. The first is our curiosity-driven portfolio, so that's discovery research, and which really aims to extend kind of frontiers of knowledge about life, health and well-being. And then the next 3 programs are more solutions focused that drive action on some of the most urgent health issues facing us all, namely infectious disease, mental health, and climate and health. Now, the health challenges we've chosen affect every part of the globe, every age group, but they don't affect every community equally, and relatively little has been done to put research at the heart of the global response to them. So we want to address these gaps and these inequalities. For infectious diseases, Wellcome is focusing on preventing and stopping future escalations of infectious diseases. So we fund cutting-edge science to understand what causes outbreaks, what drives the escalation of infectious diseases, and we also ensure sustainability and equity are considered throughout the development of effective, trustworthy, and accessible tools. In mental health, Wellcome is helping to drive a step change in mental health science to find more effective mental health solutions. So we fund a broad range of research to understand how anxiety, depression, and psychosis develop and how they resolve. And we're also driving the development of better ways to respond effectively to anxiety, depression, and psychosis as early as possible. And then in climate and health, Wellcome is bringing health to the heart of climate change action. So we're supporting science to urgently generate evidence that spurs action, and believe actions to mitigate and adapt to climate change must be informed by the evidence of their impacts on health. Coordination and cooperation are essential here for building a healthy and sustainable future. We also work with partners around the world, including governments, funders, non-governmental organisations, charities, and commercial organisations, to ensure that everyone, everywhere, benefits from advances in health and science. So where do people kind of fit into all of this? Well, I mean, apart from the incredibly long list of organisations and things we do that people are a part of, embedded across our work is a commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion is essential to achieving our aims, as is involving people with lived experience of the health issues we're exploring. We believe that groundbreaking discoveries are more likely to occur in collaborations between a diverse range of people, and so we're working with partners and the teams we fund to support a thriving, inclusive research culture. When we talk about people make research, we see this interconnected system in research of who does research, so thinking about the teams and individuals conducting research, how research is done, so that can include the design, the methods, participation, and who benefits from research, including how results are communicated and taken up into policy or practice, or at the beginning, how research priorities are set at the start of a research cycle. Ordinarily, I'd have a slide that shows a Venn diagram here, but I'm hoping you can just kind of imagine those three areas. Across all of these areas are people making choices, prioritizing, bringing their life experience to the table, and that is why it's fundamental to good research to ensure a diverse range of people are involved in the research endeavour. And importantly, none of this is done in a vacuum or in isolation. Research is a part of society, and society is a part of research. So that means the same inequalities we see in our day-to-day lives and globally permeate our research culture, our research priorities, methods, and outcomes, and it needs to be acted on. So to do this, we have to and have acknowledged that we are not in a neutral state. Inequalities exist. They exist in who gets to do research, in how research is done, and in who benefits from research. We see this in the data we collect, data about who is succeeding in a research career, who is being rewarded with funding and prizes. We see it in our health inequalities data, anything from lifespan to healthy aging and the impact of COVID-19. The data indicates structural issues and systemic issues, because if we do nothing, if we were to just let the research system continue in its current form, we know that it defaults to modes and methods that bias towards and against certain groups of people and certain types of research. And that is because of how it was originally kind of created and developed. You know, research in academia was a restricted part of society for many, many years. But we know now the value of broadening that out, not just for traditionally named researchers, but even expanding the definition of who is a researcher. Patient and public contributors, citizen science, co-creation, involvement, engagement. We have seen the benefits that has, especially in turning ideas into actual change that benefits people and society. Politics, prejudice, and privilege show up in research and health systems as much as any other sphere of human endeavour. As a result, a wealth of talent and expertise and experience has been systematically excluded from science, leading to incomplete or even distorted understandings of health and human biology. This in turn has harmed health, particularly for people in marginalised communities, whether by ignoring people's experiences or developing inappropriate interventions. Wellcome works with and within the world's dominant systems of research and health, and as such we have a responsibility to help them operate in everyone's interests. This is vital to achieve our mission and improve experiences of health for everyone and not just some. Whereas in the past, we may have unthinkingly sustained barriers to inclusive research and equitable solutions, we do now see that it is part of our mission to remove those barriers and make our systems inclusive by design. So we've begun to change. We are listening to a broader range of people, including many who have been excluded from conversations about research and health in the past. We're using our position, our connections, our power, and our independence to learn from others, think differently, and change the way things are done. Increasingly, we're working with people from marginalised and minoritized communities to develop a broader understanding of experiences and contexts of health around the world. This will help us play a part in developing research-based interventions that are wanted by and work for the people most affected by health challenges. So what have we done as Wellcome so far, and what are we going to do to address the long-standing issues of EDI in the research community, research agenda, and research process? Excuse me. So Wellcome has set 3 EDI goals as part of its strategy. And the first, by 2031, that Wellcome staff will be representative of the places we work, able to be themselves and supported to be their best. So looking at us as an employer. The second is that by 2031, people funded by Wellcome will be more representative of the global population, as well as able to be themselves and supported to be their best. So thinking about who we fund. And by 2031, all Wellcome-funded research will be inclusive in both design and practice to help drive better science and more equitable health solutions. So thinking about what we fund. Our EDI team drive these goals, but they are delivered across the organisation and are a shared responsibility. And through these goals, we're recognising that we have a role in making sure our house is in order, our processes are as equitable as possible, and that we have influence through the people and projects we fund. Within this, we've also prioritised anti-racism and anti-ableism. This is because from the data we have, these areas need the most urgent attention. Now, focus on these axes of unequal power won't be to the detriment of other aspects of diversity, as by being thoughtful about intersectionality and overlaps of inequality, the structural work that we do towards anti-racism and anti-ableism will benefit the research system much more broadly. So what have we done so far? How have we tried to change the status quo? Well, when it comes to how we fund and who we fund, we've looked at our kind of playbook, as it were. We know that something in the process, or more likely many parts of the process, for how we award funding, just isn't working for some researchers. There are some excellent researchers with brilliant ideas who just aren't getting funded. And we see an underrepresentation and discrepancy in award rates for disabled researchers, Black UK researchers, and senior women receiving large-scale grants. Similar patterns to many other funders. So we work with an organisation called Science Practice in a project led by my colleague Gerard Maguire to scope the landscape of equitable funding practices. We wanted to know what's already out there that we can learn from, and that magic question, what works? What works in reducing success rate gaps across funding? We set out to put grant makers at Wellcome one step ahead on their journey towards achieving more equitable funding outcomes by identifying existing practices that they could build on, they could adapt, they could refer to when designing their own context-specific interventions, kind of like a menu of options, as it were. And we explored the practices of many different funders working with different sectors, populations, communities, geographies, scales of implementation. And we looked beyond funding into other domains to see what was being done to improve equity, diversity, and inclusion outcomes in recruitment or university admissions and prize mechanisms. And we found more than 100 distinct methods, models, approaches, and ways of working that funders have used to address funding inequities. So there is a lot of activity here, and we can work together to learn from it. Ultimately, we built a collection featuring 50 of these in greater detail. This is a space that requires experimentation, trial and error of new models and interventions, and the practice of sharing these learnings across the wider community. It's a space where you kind of need to just be a little bit bolder and a little bit braver as a funder and try something different by acknowledging what's currently there just doesn't quite work. This collection of practices is freely accessible and available, by the way, so it's linked on our website. If you're looking for it, it's called the Equitable Funding Practice Library. And among the practices, it includes ideas for shifting power, like participatory grant making or lived experience committees. And these things work to kind of change perspectives, but they only work when they are supported and thoughtful. I'll say every kind of this works moment in this work comes with caveats, like the voices of lived experience advisors need to be actually listened to and actually included in decision making and not tokenistic. It also highlights potential ways that we might radically simplify funding in the hope of eliminating bias. That idea of, if we know bias exists in the system, why are we trying to tweak the system itself? Now, we are ones to learn from our own work, and one of the methods to support changing how we choose who to fund has recently been trialled, particularly in that simplification space. So my colleague Shamari Lewis-Wilson has recently led the first institutional funding for research culture call. So thriving research environments are essential to Wellcome's strategic aims of driving innovative research to improve health. So we delivered our first round of the institutional funding for research culture to enable organisations to move beyond their current practice and explore ways to advance their research cultures. We stated up front that if a funding decision committee was unable to fairly decide between several fundable applications, Wellcome would use a lottery funding method for those. That means that funding may be allocated randomly amongst a limited number of equally fundable applications. And we hope that this might support fairness and maybe working towards removing biases. For example, how much resource an institute already has will change what they're able to deliver. So how could you compare that, the impact of that, with a traditionally underfunded institute trying to deliver but for less? So this process was really set to kind of reduce or even remove that comparison. We remain open to considering where else we might use novel funding mechanisms to improve equity and inclusion in our calls. We might not find that the lottery approach is the most appropriate when assessing individuals, where we may want to have more of a say on what the strongest applications are within a certain field. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, so from the more hands-off trial of lottery funding, we've also adopted a more hands-on approach to lived experience advisors in our mental health challenge area. Kate Martin, head of lived experience, works with a team of lived experience advisors employed by Wellcome to shape their work. That lived experience expertise adds to the legitimacy and credibility of research and funding calls, whilst also promoting more equitable and ethical practice. Meaningful involvement means that those with lived experience can understand where treatments or diagnostic frameworks have come from, and we know it's essential to involve and include lived experience from the very beginning of a research priority agenda. That's why we have a lived experience collective within our mental health team that are involved in how we set and deliver our mental health research funding calls. So this is before we've even funded people, we're putting out ideas and they're fully involved in that process. At Wellcome, our lived experience team includes advisors from across the globe. And this allows us to thread different geographical contexts throughout our work as a global funder. We can then work towards doing research that is relevant to those that it is for, creating reasonable and appropriate treatments. It's so important to find out what, when, and with whom things work. It's important that involvement is done right, because when it's done wrong, there is a risk that involvement could be tokenistic or an isolating, alienating, or disenfranchising experience. So at Wellcome, we are constantly looking to critically review how we involve our lived experience advisors, what guidance we give around the involvement of those with lived experience in the projects we fund. So that's a lot about what we're changing about what we do already. So primarily giving out grants and how we might change that. But what are we doing about more kind of entrenched inequalities, like our particular priorities of addressing racism and addressing ableism? So when it comes to long-standing, deep inequalities such as racism, Wellcome has acknowledged its past and present role in perpetuating this and committed to actions and activities to counter and change. We've made the commitment to being an anti-racist organisation, made it publicly as well, and delivered organisational-wide anti-racism principles. We then held ourselves account with an external evaluation to measure our progress, as well as renewing our commitment with more specific actions. And that includes anti-racism training for staff, putting our money where our mouth is, and developing a dedicated funding stream for Black UK researchers. And we've also appointed our first Chief Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Professor Jimmy Volmink, who's a member of our executive team. His expertise in health equity alongside EDI is going to be such a valuable asset for our team and organisation. In relation to anti-ableism, I'd like to highlight a major new 6-year pan-national programme of disability, health and science research that we funded as a grant titled Disability Matters, led by Dan Goodley at Sheffield University. Disability Matters aims to transform health research and environments through a paradigm shift to disability as the driving subject of inquiry. The complications of being a medical research funder and trying to learn how to adopt and use the social model of disability aren't lost on us. And by funding expert researchers, we really hope to learn from their work to inform our future. The work itself foregrounds the contributions of disabled researchers and disabled people's organisations as they lead new ways of thinking about disability, health, research and science. Now, we have not got everything right in the past, and we will undoubtedly make mistakes in the future. But we recognise our responsibilities as a £38 billion global philanthropy. More than this, however, we see exciting opportunities to help ensure that research will have the greatest possible positive, fair and sustained impact on health for everyone. We also see a future in collaboration beyond our walls and in a way that isn't just Wellcome's voice, opinion or drive. So my main role at Wellcome is to lead the external facing coalition, EDIS, as part of our equity, diversity and inclusion work. And its existence and home within Wellcome is a reflection of our understanding that EDI work cannot be done in a vacuum, that collective action, collective commitments and coalition are the way forward. So EDIS stands for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in Science and Health Research. It's a growing coalition of 29 members so far, committed to working together across the sector towards a common vision. The purpose is to transform the exclusionary cultures, values, systems and structures in science and health research. We believe as a collective that science and health research and its benefits should be for everyone. And challenging these inequalities requires a powerful movement with a social justice approach. So the same systems that cause inequality in society are the same things that are perpetuated in science and health research. Our vision is therefore to build a diverse, equitable and inclusive science and health research sector to transform how research is done, who is involved and who benefits from its outcomes. So we use the strength of this coalition to advance positive change in science and health research by driving collaboration, sharing learning between our members, our partners and communities. We've built this movement to create new and inclusive and equitable norms across reward and recognition, training and education, and research and policy. And we're tackling those social inequalities at a systemic level by improving institutional policies, processes, and cultures. One of the things I love about the coalition is the different types of organizations who are willing to kind of leave personal priorities or egos at the door in order to work collectively to something that is working for the science and health research sector and system as a whole. Our power as a coalition to do this comes from building those spaces for people and organizations to collaborate. And our collective voice develops from these spaces to both represent and provide clarity to the coalition. All of this work by EDIS, by the way, is underpinned by 4 core values. The first is to be bold. We set ambitious aims. We're willing to get things wrong and share our learnings. We're making choices that align with our values, even when it's hard or maybe unpopular. The second is to engage with optimism. EDIS believes systems and processes can be changed to benefit everyone working within them. And we act with courage and compassion in our work to continually reflect on our own position, our own beliefs, and our own understanding of the world. They change with research and evidence. The third value is to centre lived experience. People with personal experience of marginalisation and injustice are prioritised in everything EDIS does. We believe that lived experience is fundamental to inclusion and research, as well as co-creation and co-design. We are open and ethical in how we work with those with lived experience, ensuring their input informs all of our actions and activities. And the fourth value is acting with integrity. EDIS takes a long-term and sustainable approach to our work and carefully considers how our choices will impact others. We are accountable to our community, to our colleagues and to ourselves, and we receive feedback with enthusiasm and a constant desire to learn. When EDIS was first created, the ambition was to elevate the conversation around EDI and the importance of no longer being passive in this area in science and health research. We've shared this in our writings, our conferences, our events, with our members and in resources, and we see it in our members' new strategies. There has been a lot of growth in this field over the last few years, and that momentum needs to be sustained, especially when ordinarily the efforts of those who are feeling the brunt of non-inclusive practices, like those from marginalised or minoritized groups, are the ones that are building that momentum in the first place. EDIS is in a unique position, having been founded by a publicly funded research institute, the Francis Crick Institute, an independent funding charity, so Wellcome Trust, and a commercial partner, GlaxoSmithKline. It showed that that collaboration across the sector was possible for something that was greater than any one of those individual organisations. Now, with an increasingly wide-ranging membership, including societies, including professional bodies, including other charities, umbrella organisations, EDIS continues to draw together these organisations to develop that coalition with more power to influence and learn and drive evidence-based change. What's wonderful, like I say, is how the different types of organisations can work together. And by pointing in the same direction with shared goals, it turns those kind of droplets of activity into tidal waves of change. The aim, as we see it as well, is not to force more people into the same system of science and health research that's governed by the same forces that amplify and perpetuate inequalities. It's to really evolve the ecosystem together holistically so that it's welcoming to all talent and potential and nurtures fulfilling careers, as well as bring the benefits of research and innovation to those who need it most. So we'll be working over the next few years across our membership towards ensuring that EDI is embedded as an integral part of the science and health research sector, and that progress is sustained through continuous policy work and collective action. Alongside this, we'll be focusing in on inclusive leadership and inclusive research across the sector as two of our core strategic goals. So, on the whole, I can say that Wellcome is doing a lot. I've barely scratched the surface of kind of activities we're delivering, commitments we've made, and changes we're undergoing. And I really can't pretend to know that everything that everyone's working on across the organisation, but I do try. But then I look at the EDIS coalition as well, and there's lots happening there too. We've got organisations that are supporting grassroots movements, that are changing policies, that are lobbying for change, that are centering people in research, even looking at decolonising the curriculums. We're on a positive trajectory. Change is happening, and we need to use our power and presence to keep supporting this change. Long gone are the days of the lone genius model of a scientist in a basement lab being applauded for his isolated idea. Restricting science to that idea limits science, it limits scientists, and it limits people from their full potential. So I've been involved in this working field professionally for 6 years after being an active part of the research system before that. And in that time, I've seen some great big commitments, including from Wellcome, some big changes, but also or under-delivered promises. It is a mixed bag. And personally, equity, diversity, and inclusion are 3 words that are starting to be said so often together, or as an acronym, EDI, like I've used in my talk, that I worry they are losing meaning sometimes. What are we really talking about here? We're talking about people, we're talking about fairness, we're talking about justice. Science and health research is done by people, with people, and for people. There is a responsibility for those involved to consider how their research might get interpreted, translated, and used, whether that's for policy change or political gain. Because of that, we really need to consider how best to conduct, design, and share research so that people are at the heart of it, so that it's protected from abuse of power, and so that it's clear what it does prove, and importantly, what it doesn't. We need to ask questions like, is this research on tackling climate change, including the health needs of the populations most affected by climate change? Or is this research on how to help young people with anxiety actually going to be able to be used by young people with anxiety? Or recently, are there limitations to vaccines based on who's been included or who hasn't been included in clinical trials, such as pregnant people or disabled people? And is their exclusion justified? Fundamentally, we are asking for a shift in research, a shift to more excellent research in how it's conceived and how it's perceived, that considers the real world implications and the people that it will benefit or leave out. We are not a bubble, nor should we act like one across research. I get invited to talk at events like this, and I can't help but say that the question on everyone's lips is always one of two things: what works, or if you could change one thing, what would it be? And these are really simple questions for an incredibly complex topic. So for what works, the best I can offer is try something rather than nothing. We will make mistakes, we won't get it all right, but trying to shift things, attempting inclusion, knowing that we're not getting it right already is the first step. I'm also constantly told by my comms team that making this work seem too complex may put people off or make it seem hopeless. So to that, I make sure I say incredibly clearly, I am full of hope for change. We have progressed research so much. The inclusion we see today didn't used to exist, and there is so much potential for the future of research. At the same time, I can say it's not good enough yet. This isn't a binary argument, both things can be true. I'll also add that the beauty of research is often in its complexity. We don't shy away from complexity when tackling tough health problems. So we should be embracing the complexity of diversity, equity, and inclusion work across the research system with the same energy and excitement for its potential as we do with the rest of science. Because people make research, and people are wonderfully diverse and complex. I think there's time for questions now. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic contribution. Thank you ever so much, Dr. Hunt. Compelling, fascinating, and at the end, they're very hopeful. I think you'll agree. I think I'm right in saying that in the Financial Times Weekend magazine a couple of weeks ago, they did do a piece exploring this issue of lottery funding to try and even things out. And I found that a fascinating concept and idea and something to think about. Now, as a journalist, I'm often accused of asking too simple questions about complicated matters, but I'm sure that's not true of this audience. So I'll come to the audience in just one moment, but we do have a question that's been submitted through the chat function for those joining us online. So let's start off with this one from Heather Payne. Is there a best practice way of representing lived experience in evidence in a milieu that tends to reject it as anecdotal? So let's kick off with that one, Dr. Hunt.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point, because unless you've changed kind of the belief system that sits amongst that evidence, it will always be seen as an add-on, like say an anecdotal piece. People don't talk about qualitative evidence from people with lived experience to the same standard as quantitative evidence, data and numbers. And I think for kind of the practice of how you do that, that has to come with the culture shift. That has to come with the understanding and the belief as to why we're including lived experience in the beginning and what changes that could lead to. For me, I don't think there is a single kind of best practice of how to do that. It's going to be context specific. It's going to be context dependent, in partly because people with lived experience of different things will need to contribute in different ways as well. But what I do see working really, really well is the consistency of lived experience. So the research cycle doesn't start once the grant has been funded, for example. The research cycle starts when the ideas of what things might need to be solved or what problems need to be discussed. That's when the research cycle starts, really. And that's where lived experience needs to be put in place, right at the very beginning of the ideas. Whoever it is in that room, around that table, who's starting to think, oh, what should we do next? Where should we go next? Lived experience needs to be there. And then it needs to be consistently threaded throughout that cycle. So it can be included in making decisions about what grants then get funded. It needs to be included in the design of research. It needs to be included in how the results are analysed and interpreted, and in the communication and engagement at the end as well. If there's any moment where lived experience is being kind of flown in helicopter style for one section of that and then flown back out, it won't be taken seriously, and it won't be able to have the lasting impact on the research that we're hoping for. And to be honest, the people who are on the side of lived experience, who are being brought in for those brief moments and then shut out again, they're not going to want to do it again. they're not going to want to be involved any further as well. So for me, it's about the consistency of approach and the fundamental belief between decision makers that this is important and this changes their decisions.
Okay, we have some questions from the audience. I think there's one down here in the corner.
I'd just like to say thank you for what you've been saying. I was diagnosed with Alzheimer's at the age of 59 and suddenly became invisible. But I've got involved with dementia inquirers, with innovations of dementia, and I'm now known as a researcher. And I do a lot with Bangor University, and they always sort of reward me with a shopping voucher. But that makes a lot of difference. I'm not just a tick box. And with the dementia inquirers, we've turned research on its head, and we're in the driving seat. Instead of researchers asking us to help them, we ask the researchers to help us research what matters to us. So I just wanted to say thank you for what you've been saying. I totally agree.
Thank you. And it's so wonderful to hear stories and moments like that where people who are experiencing something become the drivers of research, because it's so essential. And, you know, this is one field, but I've seen it in other areas as well, where it completely flips on its head where we put our money and what we're giving money to. Another one being thinking around people who are autistic or from communities with autism or autistic communities. They asked for research to change beyond kind of biomedical diagnostics into how do we navigate the health system? How do we change the health system? And that shift was so essential because that's what the communities were asking for. And similarly, there are other pieces where research has kind of moved away from the actual kind of disease itself into how do we manage pain? That's more important to us. You know, we have this disease, we have this thing, that's fine. What we want to know is how to manage the pain that sits with it. And these examples have happened and they exist out there. So we should be talking about them because they're wonderful, brilliant examples. And also, you know, recognizing that you are a researcher, that people are researchers. I remember a few years ago, I asked a collaborator, I was going, what happens if someone in the public has a research question? Where do they go? You know, if they're just there and going, oh, I wonder about this, what do they do? Because we're very privileged in the kind of space of academia and research as to knowing where we might look up if that question's been asked before, if it's been answered. But where does the public go? Where does everyone go? And that's important. How do we create those links between communities and researchers? So if something comes up like that, you can ask the question and a researcher can say, great question, let's help you find out the answer. That's what we want to be doing, people-driven research.
Right, any more from the floor? I'm sure, yes, we have right in the very end of the hall there.
Thank you. Yeah, Julia Sanders from Cardiff University. I was going to pick up on the issue that you hinted at, and that was the exclusion systematically of pregnant women from drug delivery trials and drug production. And I think that really came to a head during COVID. We've known that women have been systematically excluded for decades from drug delivery and drug effectiveness trials. And with COVID, pregnant women were excluded from the vaccine trials, and then they were excluded from receiving vaccines. And unfortunately, when they got into intensive care, they were also then often denied effective treatments. We know that there are enormous barriers to this, particularly around the risks that big pharma companies feel that they just cannot carry. And I just wondered how the Wellcome Trust are addressing this.
Yeah, this is a really important and active discussion. So the majority of the work that we've done has been primarily thinking around how to involve pregnant women, but also women of childbearing age as well in Ebola vaccines. So we've done a huge shift with the Ebola work as to how to ethically consider and include people within that space. And I think it was a clear example, because that's where you find obviously the biggest impact was on pregnant women and their children. The flip side of as well is thinking about, you know, if we are going to try and progress and move towards a space where pregnant women are included within clinical trials, there's a gap we're missing already in how we collect and use kind of that opportunistic data. There is no doubt that people get pregnant during clinical trials that they've already signed up to. What do we do with that data when it happens? Right now, the majority of people then are excluded from that point onwards, and that's it. Even if they've received some treatment already or things like that, we have the opportunity to look at follow-on studies. We have the opportunity to follow these people, to understand what the impact is with at least the opportunistic data, because that's better than no data at all. And right now we're just ignoring it because it's complex, or, you know, we haven't figured out how to ethically include the idea to include that. So it's a continuing conversation. We don't have a single stance on it right now. We definitely have a perspective that if there is an exclusion for a clinical trial, it needs to be thought through, and it doesn't need to be based on this is the way things are done. There needs to be justifications there, particularly, like I say, the majority of work, which I wish I knew more detail around, was around Ebola vaccine for us. So definitely worth looking that up in that perspective. But we're seeing a progress, we're seeing a movement forward, and, you know, so I've personally published a piece of work looking at international funders and how they include sex, gender and diversity analysis within their own research priorities and kind of the research they fund. So we're learning from others and trying to figure out what's the best approach to take in the UK there as well, and working with regulators. So yeah, watch this space. There's nothing confirmed, but we are progressing forward, and we think that there is a change that needs to be made, at least in some area.
I think we've got time for one more, if anybody's keen. Can I ask one cheeky one, if I can? Apologies if this is too simplistic a question for a very complicated problem, but hey, I'll go for it anyway. If you were to talk to friends or family or somebody down the pub about the best example of something that is happening or will happen now in terms of research that wouldn't have happened before, that reflects this shift towards a system that better reflects the society it serves, what bit of research would you point at?
It's a really tough conversation to have in a pub. I'm probably going to be 3 pints deep, so let me get into that headspace a little bit. I think for me, the bits of research that I've seen that I have been blown away by the impact of, because of how different the approach has been looking at community-led research or community-led engagement with research around actual live health issues. And the one that I'm thinking of, and I think it was in Leicester, was working with prostate cancer in men. And there was a piece of work that was done around this kind of health campaigning kind of work for the elevated risk of prostate cancer in Black men of, I believe, Caribbean ancestry. And they used community champions as the first point of contact and as the driving space for how to communicate this message and who should communicate the message. And they found community spaces like a domino hall where the messaging was best landed there as well. And for me, being a geneticist, a biomedical researcher, you know, and this was quite some years ago that I think I remember seeing this, it completely flipped on its head for me what was effective research and what was effective healthcare interventions. Because my gut reaction, all of my training, all of my teaching, all of my learning and career kind of work within research would have focused on the causes, the biomedical causes, the genetic causes, you know, what's the underpinning mechanism behind this. And realistically, I kind of realized that that was great. You know, you could tell someone a risk factor, but ultimately it was a bit useless if someone wasn't going to go to the doctors in the first place, and if someone wasn't going to understand that this was something that could affect them in the first place. So for me, that was a really kind of key moment actually in my career as well, about understanding what inclusive research really means and really looks like, and how it can really have an impact on others.
Oh, thank you ever so much, and please show your appreciation once again